plants in terms of their predicted impact. Next slide. So process moving forward, can move on to the next one. What we need to do now is what we'd like to do, and what we are working with the consultants right now to develop a work plan and some of the different stages. It's a interesting acronym, RMMEP, we call it Risk Management Measures Evaluation Process. Even the title is not necessarily self-explanatory. It's essentially another technical study that is attached to the Tier 3, and its goal is to look at more closely within that WAPA queue to understand what it means. And now we're looking into actual takings and actual recharge reduction areas. So we're going to look at what are the existing wells out there, not just municipal, but non-municipal, any other takings, and what are the areas that are potentially being developed. Because those are the two activities that under the Clean Water Act we need to look at. Takings, like consumptive water takings, and activities that reduce the recharge. And we're going to look at those specific areas, those specific activities. That's what's called here water quantity threats. That's what we kind of summarize them. Either takings or recharge reduction areas. And we're going to look at the impacts of each of those. We're going to group them, and we're going to rank them. So we're going to get a better understanding of what is actually driving that significant risk. Right now, we just have a prediction that everything is like it's a significant risk across that entire area. We want to have a better understanding of what's driving the risk. Is it going to be, is recharge reduction really a significant component? Is it the water taking? Is it the non-municipal taking, or is it the municipal taking that are interfering with each other or are driving their own risk? So getting a better understanding, this study will help us we will have a ranked, a threats ranking essentially, and then we can also look at the best measures. There's a catalog that the province put out. We can start to get an understanding of what can we do to actually, from a technical point of view, what can we do to actually address it. A lot of that will also be, or will already have been looked at through the Water Supply Master Plan, but we're essentially looking at some of those guides to select preliminary measures that could be looked at. Next slide. So in terms of the next steps, we'd like to complete the peer review process. It's currently underway. And we're commencing that technical study, the risk management measures evaluation process, to get a better understanding. That's going to be done over summer. We'd like to be able to come back in the fall with a completed peer review and completed technical study, the risk management evaluation process. Before then, 10 days from now, we'll present the preliminary results to the Source Selection Committee, so they have to have that update as well. Over summer, the peer review and the RMMEP will be completed. So in early fall, we'll be able to go to the community liaison with a complete package. We'll be able to have their input at that time. And then we'll be back in terms of having a complete and final risk assessment results. And we'll be able to go to the Source Selection Committee in October. And then I'm assuming we'll be also probably back in front of Council with an update as well. I do like to also speak in terms of the policy development. With the significant risk level, I mentioned we are required to develop those water quantity policies. You will be aware that we are in process of developing water quantity policies for the Guelph Formosa Tier 3, which is currently underway. So there's a series of, we're working on fairly large tables of different policies. The policy approaches have already been presented to the committee. We're working on presenting the draft policies for that study to the Source Selection Committee sometime in the fall. We're working on an October 3 timeline there as well. So there's already a template out there, or at least a whole selection of policies that we can look at. So we will be working together with township staff to develop a process and then come up with selection of draft policy approaches and policies that would fit this specific area. And we'll be back to present those as well. And I think that's the last slide. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Martin.
All right, so next up is Patty Quackenbush from AECOM, and Patty's the project manager for the Water Supply Master Plan project, and she's joined by Matthew Alexander, who's a hydrogeologist with AECOM, working on the project as well.
Welcome.
Okay, next slide. So the objective of our presentation today is to provide an update to the water supply master plan. We're in the process of finalizing the draft document at this point, but we recognize that the PIC 2 materials are out being reviewed by the public, and we need to allow some time to incorporate that feedback. So what we're presenting today is content from the PIC 2 materials, Tech Memo 3, as well as the draft document. So that includes review of some of the background information, an overview of the water supply alternatives, the evaluation and preliminary recommendation that was provided at PIC 2, a preliminary implementation strategy, and also some of the feedback that we received at the public consultation event. Next. So the next 10 slides were also presented to you at our meeting in January, so you'll have seen these before. We'll go through them fairly quickly just to provide some background. And it's also content of the display boards at PIC number 2 for those who were there as well, which was held as part of the Key Township Project's open house on April 24th. The purpose statement is based on the Phase 1 activities of the Master Plan Class EA. It encompasses the predictions of the future water demands to 2041. It assesses the existing water supply system capacity, and it takes those two pieces of information to determine the water supply needs for the township. Next. The master plan was completed as a Class EA study following Approach 2, which means that it satisfies part of the requirements of any of the planned Schedule B and C projects that come out of the master plan. Next. This cross-section has been included in display boards at both PICs in order to graphically show the installation of the municipal production wells into the deeper aquifers. It also demonstrates that the deep municipal wells are separated from the shallower private wells. Next. Again, this table summarizes the permitted capacity of each existing township well and provides comments related to water quality issues and the treatment requirements. Next. Our hydrogeology team completed an independent desktop review of available sustainable capacity of existing wells. Upon completion of the Tier 3 groundwater model, Matrix subsequently ran the model under various scenarios, and the outcome of each of those independent exercises was fairly close. Additional review of some of the discrepancies led to some updates in the data set and resulted in the values presented in this table, which you also saw in January, with an annual average capacity of 9,060 cubic meters per day and a maximum day capacity or a peak capacity of 12,410 cubic meters per day. So that compares to your current permitted capacity of roughly 15,000. Next, oh, you got it. So this is the work that was done to project water demand in leading to the water supply deficit calculation. So on the right side, you have population that shows that in 2041, the service population will be around 42,000. And on the left axis, it shows the maximum day demand at around 19,000 cubic meters per day. So clearly going forward, there will be a deficit in the available supply. Next. And this table summarizes that supply deficit. It compares the available sustainable supply to future needs, and it shows a deficit in the max day as early as 2026, as Martin mentioned. This considers all well capacity. We will also review this from a firm capacity perspective in the later slides. So the water supply alternatives that we've been talking about throughout this process and that we developed and evaluated in the second public consultation event included do nothing, limit growth, water conservation and efficiency, existing groundwater sources, including well replacement, and new groundwater sources, looking at new well sites, and then local surface water, which was the Grand River at the Belwood Lake Reservoir. Bill Golly from Golly Associates Limited did a bit of work for us on the water conservation and efficiency options. Bill's a renowned water efficiency expert. He's a technical advisor to US EPA's water, I can't read my writing. Anyway, he is. Anyway, he reviewed the current water demands. He found that with the residential water demand being so low, that there was little opportunity to minimize those or decrease those through water conservation efforts. So he really focused on opportunities to implement measures that target water users that are not impacted by natural savings. So those are savings that are associated with the installation of efficient plumbing fixtures and appliances. So those consisted of some more immediate measures, such as auditing Center Wellington facilities, more or less to get your own house in order first. One of the initiatives that he recommended was Fix a Leak Week, and that's borrowing from the US EPA's program. The materials are already there. It's just something that you can subscribe to and easily implement. He talked about a website update. There's materials already on your website, but that could be enhanced and provide a bit more information to the public, including some of the successes that you gain internally. And then continuing with the municipality's system leak detection and repair. So recognizing that that's currently done, he said that you could do a more intensive 365-day baseline so that it's something that's monitored on an ongoing basis to more proactively detect when there's deviations from the patterns that you would anticipate seeing. He also recommended a couple programs for future consideration. One was an irrigation reduction program, another ICI customer incentive programs, and those are ones that the consumers would subscribe to, so most of the cost and initiative lies with them, but the township could make those available. Matt's going to take over from groundwater while I try to figure out what I wrote there.
Thank you, Patty. So as Patty mentioned, one of the alternative solutions that we looked at for meeting the projected deficit in the system to 2041 was well replacement. So we looked at existing wells F2 and F5. At the F2 location, the well has been deemed goody, which is groundwater under direct influence of surface water. There have been historical interference impacts reported associated with that well also. So the recommendation with well F2 is to install a deeper replacement well targeting the deeper formations, Goat Island and Gasport, with a well that's approximately 116 meters deep and cased through the Guelph Formation. At well F5, there's been a history of turbidity in the water there. So the study included a recommendation to look at replacing this well with a well to a similar depth. The current well targets the Goat Island and Gasport formations. With a replacement well would be cased into the Guelph Formation. So the modeling exercise that we completed looked at replacement wells on these two sites and concluded from that the operation of new wells on that site in conjunction with the existing wells would not cause adverse impacts with private wells or the surface water system, looking at wells, wetlands, and streams in the area. In terms of the capacity predicted to be produced from that solution, it was, we'll see in the next slide, partially addressed the projected deficit to 2041. You can flip to the next slide, please. We see it here in numbers, so the green highlighted rows indicate the estimated productivity from those replacement wells, and we see the last line in the table that there wouldn't fully address the 2041 demand with firm capacity considered. Next slide, please. So one of the items that we considered in particular with respect to F2 was the known water quality issue at the F1 well location where raw water is treated for TCE. This well, F1, obtains water from the Guelph and Goat Island formations down to a depth of about 79.5 meters. There's been some previous work done in the early 90s when the water quality issue at that location was first determined that identified one known source of TCE contamination and other potential sources largely located to the southwest of that F1 well location. Further technical work concluded that the F1 well acts as a hydraulic trap. So what this means is that the groundwater pressures in the aquifer at the location of F1 are lower than the surrounding area, indicating that the groundwater flow in that location is towards the F1 location. So in order to consider and address this potential issue with the F2 location, as I mentioned a couple slides ago, the recommendation is for a deeper well at this location, which is cased through the Guelph formation. The modeling work that's been done previously for the wellhead protection area modeling is shown in the upper graphic on this slide, and it indicates that for wells F2 and F5 located towards the central and east portions of Fergus, they primarily capture water from the east of Fergus, so it's sort of towards the south and east of Belwood Lake. So this provides an indication of the source of water that we'd expect for a replacement well at those two locations. The modeling that we did as part of this study looked at maintaining water level elevations higher at the F2 location, similar to the current situation, so that water would continue to be flowing inwards towards F1, thereby mitigating flow of the contaminant to F2. Now, the last bullet on this slide sort of is an indication of the further work that would be required to assess a new well at the F2 location. So the next step would be detailed field testing through a test well with technical work done at that location to evaluate both the quantity and quality of the local aquifer in the location of a replacement well. Next slide, please. So this slide speaks to the evaluation that was done for new well sites. This and the subsequent slides, and the next a couple of slides anyhow, will look familiar from when we spoke to you in January. It talks about the considerations that went into evaluating potential new well areas, 1 through 8, shown in the figure on the right. So there were several categories, and each category had criteria that were evaluated to assess each of the categories. So we looked at the financial interference drawdown potential aquifer productivity, water quality, and ecology. So out of those categories, we've selected a couple of slides just to highlight the categories in more detail that were looked at. So if you could flip to the next one, please. So first, potential interference drawdown features. So there's sort of a dark blue contour on the map, and what this is showing is the estimated location of 5 meters of drawdown as determined by the model over long-term pumping. So this is pumping of the existing wells. The area inside of the dark blue contour would be drawdown in excess of 5 meters. So this was used as a tool so that areas were ideally located outside of the contour, thereby minimizing the interference drawdown with the existing wells and a new potential well at one or multiple of these locations. Other factors considered and displayed on this slide are the location and the density of MECP water well records, with the concept being that the higher the density of wells, the higher the potential for interference with private well use, private groundwater use in each area. Finally, the density of permits to take water were evaluated. Again, higher demand on the system from water takings under a permit to take water would indicate more stress in the area, potentially on the aquifer system. There's an inset box in the bottom left asking the question, how are future proposed water takings being assessed in the water supply master plan? So again, we did discuss this last time, but I wanted to review this again. So with the modeling work, the baseline work looking at the existing well system considered only existing approved permits to take water as extracting groundwater in the modeling scenario. We also looked at future groundwater supply at these potential new areas, and initially, again, just considered the permitted sources. We also ran a scenario that looked at, now, in consideration of the infrastructure we think will be required to meet the 2041 demand, what would be the potential impact of potential future takings under a permit to take water? So in this case, the potential future taking at the Middlebrook site was the future taking that we were aware of through discussion with the township and presentation of the PIC. So we used the previous pumping rates at that site and to understand how that could potentially affect the system at the existing wells and also the potential new well locations. So the result from this work was we estimated that on a max day basis, the capacity of the system could be reduced by approximately 560 cubic meters per day with that well pumping. And so what this tells us is that amount would increase the deficit, so the existing wells would be able to produce that much less. Next slide, please. This slide addresses aquifer water quality in the locations of potential new wells. And so we reviewed a database the township maintains of known or potentially contaminated sites. The new well areas do not have any of those features located within them. We looked at land use within each well area buffer, with most of them being outside of certainly outside of the urban envelope, the current urban envelope. Agriculture was a common land use, as you'd expect. Rural residential. Area 3 had an aggregate extraction operation present. There are a number of commercial land uses, particularly within, I believe, well area number 6, and then recreational and forested areas where there's green spaces. This category considered the presence of a regional aquitard as determined through the regional characterization done under the Tier 3 study. And then water quality data, where available, was evaluated for each of the potential well areas. Next slide, please. So apologies for all the text here. It worked well at the PIC where it was blown up quite large, but we wanted to make sure we had the detail for the public to review in terms of the main points that were considered at each area when we got to the step of deciding or determining which well areas would be carried forward to the detailed modeling step. And so through the result of the process were these areas highlighted in red being carried forward, so number 2, 3, 5, 7, and 8. Next slide, please. So this graphic sort of summarizes from the groundwater alternative option where we ended up. So the graphic on the left sort of indicates the top. We looked at baseline conditions, so the existing wells, to understand what they could produce and what that projected deficit would be, and then underneath the dotted circle are the two options that we looked at, so potential well replacements and then new well sites, and all of these two options coming together to determine if we could address the projected 2041 demand deficit. So we show these two tables on the sort of the center and right side of the slide are two example combinations that we evaluated as being able to address the identified issue. So the first one is the installation, construction of 4 new wells. So the 4 of the areas that we identified in that previous map. And so we can see on the very last line in this table, after the well replacement option was evaluated, we saw this as red in a negative deficit position here. It addresses the 2041 demand with firm capacity considered. And so that's the 4 new wells. And then on the right-hand side shows an example where the problem is addressed with a replacement of F2 and 3 new wells outside of the existing system. Again, we have a positive or a surplus at the end of the evaluation, and in this case, slightly more water available above the 2041 demand with firm capacity considered. So Patty's going to speak to the surface water evaluation.
Okay, so as you're aware, we also looked at potential for surface water for water supply with the water taking at Belwood Lake. We looked at it from 2 perspectives. One was water quality and the other was water quantity. There was some available water quality information which suggested it would require advanced water treatment similar to other water treatment plants that are on the Grand River. So that is a very expensive and complex water treatment facility. Next. The water quality evaluation referenced the GRCA operational low flow targets and whether it could be sustained with the proposed water takings. So we looked at it in 2 ways. One was to satisfy all of the 2041 maximum day demand through surface water as a source, and that compromised the low flow targets for GRCA. So then we looked at it from whether it could be used to supplement the existing well capacity supply, and that was achievable. So that we moved forward with this alternative for comparison to the groundwater options through the evaluation. Which is next. So preliminary evaluation was provided at the PIC2. This is just a summary of some more detailed information that was provided in Tech Memo 3. It includes all of the water supply options, including do nothing and limit growth that we've discussed earlier. And it evaluated it against a number of indicators for each of the main categories of criteria. So natural environment, social, cultural. On the next slide, there's technical complexity, the built environment, and financial. At the end of the day, the preliminary recommendation was for first to replace existing wells F2 and F5. It offers the advantages of there's a known water quantity. The cost for redevelopment of those 2 sites is lowest. There's existing infrastructure that it can be tied into, and there's established wellhead protection areas for those wells. Unfortunately, it does not fully satisfy the future water supply requirements, so we still need to go beyond that in developing a preferred solution. Also preferred was conservation and water efficiency. Just recommended basically as good general practice. We want to maintain the low residential demands that are currently achieved in the township and implement ICI programs as are applicable. Again, we haven't assigned any real reductions to these water conservation efforts, but they're worthwhile pursuing. So that takes us to a third option, which is new well sites. So through the groundwater modeling and consideration of the other criteria, such as natural environment, there were 4 well site areas that were recommended to proceed. Areas 3, 5, 7, and 8. Area 2 fell out of that list, even though it was considered in the graphs that Matt provided, because it resulted in some interference with, excuse me, with F5. Now, one thing that Matt was showing was some example combinations of well replacements and new wells that would satisfy the 2041 demand. Those were offered just to demonstrate that combination of these preferred alternatives would satisfy that demand going forward, but through the implementation phase of the project, we're looking at what makes sense, in what order, all to be confirmed through a groundwater exploration study. So that's where we're going next. So the next slide, the water demand, average and maximum day demand, is the same as what you saw on an earlier slide, but against that we've shown all of the various capacities with new supplies added. And we've taken a firm capacity approach. So the firm capacity is the remaining total capacity where you've taken one well or one well facility offline. There's no hard and fast rules for determining firm capacity when it comes to a groundwater supply. It's more typically applied to a something like a pumping station or a water treatment plant where you take the largest piece out of offline and your firm capacity is what's remaining. With groundwater supply, it's really up to municipality to determine how you want to develop a firm capacity, but this is the approach that we've taken here for consideration. So what we've done here is we've selected an order of priority of facilities as they come online to demonstrate how they meet the proposed demand. So the first dotted orange line is your existing firm capacity. So that's the capacity with your largest existing well offline, which is 2250 cubic meters per day, and that leaves you with 10,160 cubic meters per day. So where we talked before about you don't hit that number until you get to 2026, you're now seeing that number in 2019, 2020, because with that largest well offline, that's your remaining capacity. So we go from there, we add F5, which only gives you another 800 cubic meters per day of peak capacity because you're already counting some of that as part of your existing firm capacity. So when you re-drill that well, it's giving you a supplemental amount, but you can't recount the full total. So that gives you about another 800 cubic meters per day. Add a full replacement of F2. That takes you to the blue line, and then we're adding in the 3 wells sequentially, 3, 5, and 8. And that satisfies, or more than satisfies, your 2041 demand. Having said that, just following 2041, say 2043, 2044, is when you'll need another well. So in the implementation strategy, we look at the steps required to have that online within the 2041 timeframe. Next. So this is a list of the projects that we talked about, F5, F2, areas 3, 5, 8, 7. The column in the middle is the year that the supply is required. So that's what we saw on the previous graph. And one thing that's a little bit confusing with that graph is it looks in the graph like you have, if you can go just back one, I'll just explain this. So it looks like you have until you get to the blue line, for example, to bring that well online. That's not the case. When you hit the purple line, it means you need to have that blue capacity available. It's a little confusing, I know. Okay, next. Okay, so when you take that information and you put it in the table, you need to replace F5 immediately. F2 is needed in 2022, Area 3, 2028, 2033, 2039. So we've determined what the year required for that well supply to be online. We've targeted it for it to be in place a couple years before that's actually needed to allow for uncertainties. And so that implementation you'll see is 2 years prior, with the exception of F5. The general timeline for implementing new water supplies is in around 5 to 6 years. It's 2 years for the groundwater investigation and EA phase, a year to install a test well and do testing. need to develop the wellhead protection areas and incorporate it into source water protection plans and policies, and 2 years for design and construction. So when you back that up from the year that it's going to be implemented, that's where the timelines for the preliminary studies and design are coming from. So the timelines that are shown for F2 and F5 are a bit shorter than that 5 to 6 year window. You don't need to do all of the studies that you need, or the EAs for the new wells. Although F5 you still need a Schedule B. Okay, so there are individual slides, which I'm not going to go through in detail, but there's one for each project. And this will be included in the Water Supply Master Plan document. These project sheets are for all of the proposed projects. They provide description and details, environmental constraints, required studies, water quality issues, required approvals, and then capital costs along with the timeline. So they're available for each project with all of the information needed to go forward. So there's F5, and we can just flip through these. Next one's F2, new supply well in area 3, new supply well in area 5, new supply well in area 8, and then 7. Lastly, there's an implementation strategy that's also captured in the Water Supply Master Plan document. So this is, in summary form, it's a capital cost forecast that defines the expenditures for each phase of the project, and it can be adjusted as the township sees fit. If work is desired to happen further in advance than what is shown, and it would be updated with every Water Supply Master Plan update, which is generally recommended every 5 to 10 years. So it provides a strategy going forward with a financial plan, but it certainly is something that would get updated along the way. Lastly, the Water Supply Master Plan document also speaks to additional considerations for the proposed Class EA undertakings. So that would include cultural heritage assessments for both built heritage and cultural landscape, archaeological resources, natural environment considerations and mitigation measures, and climate change considerations. So there are sections on those in the draft document. So Matt's just going to speak to the next steps regarding the recommended groundwater exploration.
So this slide touches on some of the information I touched on earlier in the presentation in terms of, next steps in field implementation for the various projects that we've recommended through the Water Supply Master Plan. So on the left side of the screen is a bullet list of the steps we see being required for the well replacement option. So F2 and F5. So I mentioned earlier, the next step will be drilling of test wells on these sites. The second bullet in particular for well site F2, we recommended the drilling and installation of a multi-level sentry well between the F2 site and F1 site. I spoke earlier about the groundwater quality, known groundwater quality at F1, and so the purpose of this would be to understand both aquifer water levels and aquifer water quality within the various zones of the system at that location. The test well would be pumped through a pumping test to understand the quantity and quality of the aquifer at the location of the replacement well. Part of that work would also be an impact assessment, so understanding drawdown away from the well site and potential impacts on surface water features, wetlands, private wells, and any other potential receptors. Patty made reference to the EA requirements, so Schedule B Class EA for well site F2, because in this case it would be the replacement well would be rated for a higher capacity than the existing, which makes it Schedule B, and then F5 where the proposed rate is lower than the current rated well, it would be Schedule A. So this part of the EA process would be drilling of production well, construction of the well, and testing of the well. So you're looking at the same factors, quantity and quality, impact assessment, just for the full-scale production well. And finally, the final step would be the amendment of the permit to take water to incorporate these wells into the permit. So for the new exploration areas, similar process, except of course it would be we don't have established well houses and well property at those locations. So for the first step, we're looking at it as a test well to be constructed within municipal right-of-way or on municipal property or township property where it's available, but no acquisition of land at that stage. Monitoring wells will be drilled along with the test wells to understand drawdown away from each test well location. And then again, quantity and quality testing to understand the characteristics of the aquifer at each location, and an evaluation of potential impacts away from that test well location. For the new wells, they would all be Schedule B EAs. That's because we're establishing, in this case, new well sites, new wells and new distribution as well. Also, excuse me. And then for scaling up to full production wells at those sites, we go through the same process as was discussed for the F2 and F5 cases, where production well is drilled, quality and quantity is tested, impact assessments completed for the groundwater receptors within the zone of influence, and ultimately the permit to take water would be amended to incorporate each of these new wells. Next slide, please. We have a few slides here that discuss some of the feedback that we received through the public and agency consultation process. It was quite an engaging process, and we did receive a lot of feedback. So what we've tried to do on these slides is highlight some of the main themes that were received by the project team. Now, through the presentation, we've certainly spoken to a number of these points. In particular, I've talked a lot about a replacement well at F2, the concern about TCE at F1. Excuse me. And I've just sort of in the blue bullets there, we reiterated some of the points. So talking about this strategy that we've discussed in terms of maintaining groundwater levels at the F1 and F2 locations to mitigate the movement of that contaminant, and also the recommendations for the design of well F2 itself to mitigate shallow impacts to private wells and the Goody issue that I discussed earlier. There were some comments about the option of using Belwood Lake or the Grand River as a supply. Those didn't end up through the technical evaluation. They were not recommended as alternative solutions. So that they certainly the comments we received were in line with that. In terms of the new well sites, we had a variety of feedback related to the A2, 3, 5, 7, and 8, which were carried forward in the evaluation process. So we took in that input, and through the final step following PEIC 2 of completing the evaluation of alternatives, we took in that feedback and produced the draft water supply master plan document incorporating those comments. There was concern, I talked about a bit earlier about Middlebrook and its effect on well area 3, existing well sites, and that was evaluated using the model as I mentioned, and we quantitatively determined that approximately 560 cubic meters per day would be the reduction in the capacity of the existing system with Middlebrook pumping. So certainly one point there is we're looking backwards a certain degree, understanding how it was proposed to be used in the past, and using those conditions for this assessment. So there's obviously some factors there moving forward with some unknowns in terms of how that property will be used, but it's I think a starting point for understanding how that well operates within the greater system. I think Patty, you going to speak to this one?
Okay, so there are also a number of comments related to the prioritization of alternatives in the evaluation outputs. The first one was related to that support for conservation measures should rank higher. So the response to that is that it is part of the preferred solution, but it doesn't satisfy the future demand requirements on its own. We do recognize that it's good practice, but as the current per capita residential demand is already very low, there's limited opportunity to gain a lot of more capacity in that way. And the recommended focus of the water conservation alternative was some soft measures, so water conservation and efficiency education being the primary one, as well as some programs that target specific high users. The second comment, and we've heard this a few times, related to the timeline of 2041 for the Water Supply Master Plan. Generally, master plans align with official plan growth projections. To go beyond that, it can be somewhat speculative. We do recognize, though, that we do look beyond 2041, recognizing that the timeline to develop water supply takes time, so that for water supply that's needed shortly after 2041, the measures to capture that fall within that timeline. So we've done that in that last project. That water's not needed until I think it's around 2043, 2044, but we've taken the steps that are required to ensure that that's in place by the time that it's needed. And notwithstanding that, the Water Supply Master Plan is a document that will be regularly updated at 5 to 10 intervals, so you always have the opportunity to keep moving that timeline forward and looking further out. There was a comment about sense of urgency in the solution and implementation to make sure that the water's there when it's needed for both residents and businesses. And that's what the implementation plan is all about, is to make sure that the water supply matches the growth projections with a little bit of buffer to allow for unforeseen events. And lastly, there was a comment or two regarding combining Fergus and Elora into one system, and that should be prioritized. So the water distribution system is one combined system connected through a water main and a booster pumping station. There will be a separate water servicing study that will review distribution infrastructure requirements. So that would encompass distribution system, any pumping stations, water storage. So this is strictly looking at water supply. Next is next steps. Where we're at now is we have pulled together a draft document which will be reviewed by staff while we continue to take public comment and make sure that those have been addressed through the documentation. We'll refine the implementation strategy accordingly to reflect any of that input. And then it will be submitted back to staff and through Township Council. And I understand we'll be back in front of you July 22nd to answer any questions on the draft document. And then with your blessing, it will go to public review, the 30-day public review period through July and August, and then we'll finalize that document. And that's it.
Great, thank you very much, Patricia and Matthew. And I'm going to open it up for questions. As you can imagine, there's a lot of information here. This is a pretty detailed assessment, and I think it made a lot of sense that we did these two projects hand in hand. So I'm not sure. I know that Sonia and Martin do have to go at some point. So, but I'm not sure if we can tailor our questions to just the Tier 3 or just the long-term water master plan. But Colin, if you could help us do that as much as possible, that'd be appreciated. And then I know, again, as I mentioned, a lot of work went into this, and appreciate you bring these reports to us. And I just want to remind people that we're not looking to approve these documents. Again, this is going out. This is the first introduction to council of this report, the water master plan, and it won't be approved to council or till July. So just it is going out now for public consultation and questions from council. So I'll hand it over to, do you want to add anything, Colin? Are you good? Okay. Questions from council. Councillor McCrae.
Thank you, Mayor Linton. Colin, I submitted a number of questions this morning, probably too late to get answers to all of them, but are there some that you're able to provide answers to? I guess the biggest one for me is, does the water supply master plan basically say that if Middlebrook is operating, it's going to cause problems for our existing wells, which means really Middlebrook is something we do not want to happen?
I'm going to ask Matthew to speak to that. We did look at your questions. I did forward them to Patty and Matt, so they are aware of them. And hopefully the presentation answered some of them, but maybe Matt can elaborate on the effects of Middlebrook.
So through you, Mayor Linton. So I mentioned the reduction in the capacity that we evaluated to be the reduction in relation to pumping of Middlebrook. So what that means is it increases the deficit in the, relative to that long-term planning horizon, and would mean that potentially if it was operated as we simulated it in the model, that additional supply would be required to compensate for that reduction. So there were certain scenarios around where new well sites would be located that were affected by that well in operation. So it isn't a situation where with that well in operation, the water supply needs in the future can't be met. But certainly it factors into where the water would come from and how the current wells E3 and E4 and Elora would be the capacity of those wells would be.
So can you just follow up with one of the things that you mentioned? What assumptions did you make and on how much water would be pumped out of Middlebrook? Like, I know nothing has happened yet, so you would have had to make some assumptions. So just run through what kinds of assumptions you made there.
Sure. Yep. So the key assumption, it's the existing well, so no modifications in terms of depth or location, of course, and that it would be pumping at an extraction rate that equals the previous permit to take water, so the amount that was permitted by the ministry previously. And so it would be on a daily basis pumping to the maximum permitted by the ministry previously, prior to the moratorium. Yeah, about 1600.
So the assumption was to the maximum of what their permit would have allowed based on the previous permit.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
That's correct.
Councilor McCray?
So, if I understand it correctly, with Middlebrook up and running, it would be decreasing the amount of water by 560 cubic meters, which means that would force us to have to look for maybe another well to supplement that water that's disappearing from our wells. So that would be a cost to our community.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Councilor Kitchus?
Thank you, Mayor. Can you explain on page 21, item 332, industrial, commercial, industrial customer incentive program? I don't know who will explain that, but.
Okay, yeah, so in traditional capacity buyback programs, municipalities have taken the initiative to send folks out to do a review of a facility, find water savings, and they'll pay an industry to implement certain measures to get that capacity back so that they can take that and then sell it to somebody else, basically. What Bill is suggesting here is a different approach, where an industry or business would take the initiative themselves, and they would implement measures to improve their water efficiency or decrease their water demands, and they would apply to the township for a rebate related to that savings.
Okay.
So I'm not clear on, I think he proposed this as an option for the township to consider going forward, but he didn't identify any particular industries where it would be applicable.
I have a
But it
follow-up.
did make its way into the final recommendation to us though, right? Okay.
Can I
Councilor
follow up
Kitchus,
there?
following?
On the bottom of page 21, it says industrial, commercial, institutional customers represent only 8% of the total customer base, but use 26% of the total water demand. Where did you get that data?
That comes from the water billings information.
Okay. Can I follow up?
Yeah, follow up to follow up.
I'm just wondering how much F5, F2 will cost us, since that's immediate, we have to do those.
Do you have the appendices here?
I can't read that small, sorry.
This one? Oh, that's the, oh, okay. This isn't A though, this is the cost appendices. Oh, there we go. Okay, so F2, we have a budget of 1.8 million. That includes contractor overhead profit, contingencies, engineering, design, and construction. So that's the number encompassing everything. F5 is 1.377 million. And again, my comment related to that is that it's buying you, it's completely replacing your well. So the costs are not that dissimilar to F2 because you've got to, it's the same type of installation, but it's only buying you supplemental capacity over and above what you have today.
I have another question.
Is it follow-up to the follow-up, or is
It
it a new
is.
question?
It's a follow-up on this
Follow-up to the
non-residential.
follow-up to the follow-up? Okay, Councilor Kitchus?
Okay.
I'm wondering, with this new information and the immediacy of these two wells, which will be close to $4 million, whether we should revisit the development charges on the non-residential, which we lowered over a year ago drastically. I mean, that's one of the discussions we should have here about water. That was never put on the table at that time when we reduced the non-residential development charges. And I think that's almost, has to be done almost immediately to the previous charges that we had. So my recommendation for staff is to come forward with that proposal to increase development charges on non-residential going forward, because we had no idea that we would be having to spend basically $4 million immediately almost, and also to add having to have another well almost immediately after that. So within 5 years, we'll have to be doing 3, and to lower something that is a quarter of our water demand and only going to be increasing, I think that staff should come forward with something very, very soon to redo that.
Well, I think I'm gonna take a stab at that first, because there is, staff can only go by approved documentation and approved reports, so this hasn't been approved yet. So any follow-on or any kind of downstream impacts it's gonna have, obviously have to come through our process. So we're looking at our water needs going forward, and obviously there's gonna be costs that we're gonna have to talk about, and what we're gonna have to do about it, and where the money comes from. So that's, this has to be approved first, and then council might direct staff to do something about it. But until then, there's nothing to do until this documents approved. Do you want to add anything to that, Dan?
Yeah, just that we do have some pending changes in DC legislation that hopefully gets sorted out in the same amount of time it takes for council to pass this, which is estimated to be in July. So hopefully we get some more information from the provincial government on the DC legislation and we can act accordingly at that point.
Right, but obviously any kind of ramifications or implications coming out of these long-term studies will be fed through our DC process. Councillor Dunsmore?
Okay, so my concerns are around the F2 and F5 wells. And I'm looking at the figures here and it's 3,223,000. Is that just for drilling them deeper? I'll have to follow.
So sorry, just to clarify, the question, just kind of a breakdown of what those costs related to?
Right.
Why is
So,
it
yeah,
cost?
what is that cost for?
Yeah,
Are we
what
just
does that
talking about
include?
drilling those 2 wells deeper and you talked about encasing them or whatever?
Yeah.
Is that what the 3 million gets us?
Yeah, so I think there's a breakdown, fairly detailed breakdown in the appendices on what's included, so I'll get maybe
Sorry, I
Patty
was
to.
just going to offer some clarity around that. So the detailed breakdowns include the groundwater exploration phase, as well as any EA requirements and studies, preliminary studies. So for example, for F2, of the total cost of 1.8, 850,000 of that plus the 35% contingency is engineering and design are part of that cost. So roughly half the cost is in those preliminary studies. So if you've already captured that elsewhere, that would be double counting, right? So, and that's the same for F5. There's no EA requirement for F5, but we've allowed for the groundwater exploration and the production well construction and testing as part of that overall cost.
Does that answer your question? Yeah, Councillor Dunsmore?
So a lot of the information I'm hearing is that F2 and F5 have a lot of water quality issue problems. There brownfield contamination on F2, I believe, and there's other problems with F5, right? Or am I confusing wells?
Through you, Mayor. No, so the issue with F2 was the Goody designation, so that's a surface water impact. I also mentioned that there have been historical complaints of private well impacts from F2. Yeah, and that F5, there are turbidity issues in the water.
Follow up to my
Follow-up to your follow-up, Councillor Dunsmore?
Okay. So what I'd like to know then is what is the cost of actually shutting these 2 down, if it's possible, and drilling another well somewhere else? So my concern about drilling deeper is if we draw contaminants down and we spent $3 million and then we have the same problem down the road. We just made things a little bit worse. To me, should we look at going somewhere else completely and not using these wells at all? And do we have numbers associated with that?
We do, yeah. So we presented costs for completely new wells along with treatment and distribution at those locations. So a cost was provided. I believe we did individual costs for each new well area. So yeah. So in the appendices of the report, there's
Follow-up?
Sorry, I don't think he was done.
Yeah, so I was just going to highlight that in the appendices of the water supply master plan document, there's a breakdown for each of the projects, so each of the new well areas as well.
Councillor Dunsmore?
So is it possible to shut those wells down and take water from a completely different area, not use those 2 sites at all?
Is it possible? So one of the sort of example solutions that we presented was all new well sites. So in terms of addressing the quantity, the deficit to the 2041 time period, all new wells was an option for addressing that problem.
I think if you could just explain a little bit the casing, because I think we're not paying attention to the casing around it, because I think that's why you're trying to get the infringement of surface water into the deep well. I think there needs to be a little bit of understanding about what the casing does and how you can use an existing well.
Okay. So the existing well, F2, is a shallow cased well. So the casing extends a small distance into the bedrock, and from that point, it's an open hole bedrock well. So the well is obtaining water from fractures all the way along the open hole. Whereas a cased well, a well that is cased deeper, will be drawing water primarily from the open fractures, so the open portion of the borehole. And so the deeper the hole, you're obtaining water from that deeper in the formation. So it mitigates against, in this case with F2, where there have been indications of surface water impacts in the supply in the well. So water from the surface is making its way into what the well is pumping. This is a way to mitigate against that issue.
But then the rationale that you were giving is that because you're so close to the system, it's not the same cost as if you're doing another well, because you're still in the right location. So the casing is the way to make it more cost effective. Is that accurate?
Yeah, through Mayor Linton. So, yeah, and it's a cost. Like we called it an optimization step, and we're kind of looking ballpark 1.3 million for those locations. Like a new well with a feeder main are also presented. We've got 4 locations identified there, and we're kind of in the order of magnitude of, I saw 5 to 6 million per location. So, well, yeah. So we look at F1 and F2. Obviously, there's going to be testing. There is part of a groundwater exploration program. We want to test the aquifer, the deeper section of the aquifer at that location from water quality perspective, from a quantity perspective, and that'll inform the next steps. So as to whether we proceed with formalizing that as a well or not. But in terms of the cost and the potential benefits, I think from the project team's perspective, and it's worth taking it to the next step.
Councilor McRae?
Thank you, Mayor Lynn. I have some questions here from some concerned citizens of Center Wellington, if I can just go through these. Okay, so the first one has to do with proposed future well capacity. So tables 11 and 12 on page 28, groundwater supply alternative summary, show proposed peak capacities from 4 future wells. These include a redrilled well F2 and new wells in areas 3, 5, 7, and 8. The expected capacities of these proposed new wells are very high. The question is, are they reasonable? So I guess maybe I'll just one at a time.
Sure. Yep, through you, Mayor. Are they reasonable? So I think we've presented the information that we had available to review and the process we followed. So so we've simulated new wells at those new locations, and arrived at those values. So there was a process of reviewing the results, and from just that perspective, you know, what are there any red flags or anything further we need to consider at this stage to arrive at what we could potentially obtain from the new wells. So, you know, until the results are field proven, they're model results that need to be verified. But we felt that they were reasonable to evaluate for the purpose of evaluating these results.
Councilor Kitchers?
So those new wells that you have, they're like 2,500 to 28, 29, some of them. And some of them are they're 4 to 5 times more than our existing wells. Mm-hmm. Why would we drill new wells like in new locations if we could just optimize and get those 2,500 for the existing wells? Because some of them we have like 400 or 700, and why would we need to drill new wells if we could get that optimum value that you've projected?
So one thing I wanted to say about the numbers that you're quoting, the values that you're quoting. So we have both the average day and the max day capacities. So when you, in comparison to the average pumping or how the existing wells have performed, I think it's important to understand that for the max day scenario, we've talked about being able to produce that amount of water over a 30-day period, so relatively short period of time during the period of increased demand. So it's not saying that the wells at those locations could provide that capacity into perpetuity in terms of every day. But it is those smaller snapshots of time to meet the increased demand.
Well, is it follow-up, because I got Councilor McCray, is it follow-up to the follow-up? Yes. Okay, Councilor Kittredge?
I'm just wondering, and it's follow-up to Councilors McCray, how you could get numbers that large when the actual existing, what we have tested and we pumped, and you say we can't even do the maximum, how you could get those numbers? Like,
So I think, sorry, through you, Mayor. I think one other point to consider is the performance of wells over time. So wells typically have their highest performance when they're first constructed and first put into use, and over time a maintenance and rehabilitation program is required to address reduced capacity over time, which is a natural process due to a number of different factors that can cause that the capacity of the well to deteriorate over time. For a new well, you expect that higher level of performance for the 5 to 10 year period. Quite often rehabilitation and maintenance studies are done over a 5 to 10 year period on an ongoing basis to address that reduction in capacity over time. So a number of the wells in the system, the existing wells, were tested and permitted around 2,000 cubic meters per day when they were first installed. And what we've seen through the study and evaluating the data over time is how you do get deterioration in the performance over time.
Councilor McCray?
Thank you, Mary Lynn. Following up from Councillor Kittredge's question, I guess I'm curious, what is the average lifespan for a municipal well? Like, I understand Region Waterloo focuses on 80 years, roughly.
Well, it's certainly a complicated factor because it depends on groundwater chemistry and how the wells are operated and maintained. We've worked with a number of deep wells in York region that are in the range of, on the high end, about 50 years, which are all still in regular use. But again, maintenance and regular maintenance and rehabilitation programs are required to maintain capacity and use them on an ongoing basis. So in order to quote an average number, I'd have to do a bit of research to give you an informed number, but certainly we've worked with many wells that are in the 50-year range and are still functioning quite well. So the 80 years that you mentioned for Region of Waterloo certainly fits into that time frame.
Councilor McCray?
I guess this other question, keeping options open. I'll just read this out. Historically, engineers have had to go to the second choice of site for a new well, since unforeseen factors determined the first selected site was not usable. For example, for well F6, on investigation of the first site in West Garifaxa, the ground proved to be too unstable for a pump and well, so they decided on the second choice of site on Guardshore. For well E4, the first test well into the buried valley unexpectedly produced poor quality water, and so a new site was selected 1 kilometer closer to town. It would seem to be a good idea to keep options open in case they're needed when investigation for well sites begins. So basically what you're showing are just, you could be locating a new well within those radiuses that you're showing, but at the end of the day, it's going to be whatever the test results show in terms of best source for water.
Absolutely, yeah, through you, Mayor. Yeah, I certainly agree with that comment. And it was part of the reason that we presented the well areas as we did with the 1 kilometer radius around a central point. Understanding that through this, a level done at this, a study done at this level gives you a general idea of where to concentrate your efforts, but a borehole represents a small sample location, and certainly, there's no guarantee of the results at that specific location. So yeah, it's certainly not uncommon, particularly with in fractured bedrock where it's you may have very localized fractures that are feeding a well that don't extend, hundreds of meters. You can see differences over that size of area.
Councilor McCray?
Climate change. On page 9 of matrix section 4.3, effective drought conditions, the study evaluated the effect of drought conditions on water levels at the municipal wells. This was done by simulating historical drought conditions with data from a drought in the 1960s and another in the 1990s. For climate change, should a scenario not be run with these drought conditions amplified, even doubled? And should there not be multiple parameters of climate change? How much precipitation falls as snow, which recharges more effectively than rain? How much falls during severe storms where a large proportion runs off into streams and storm sewers and does not replenish the groundwater?
So the two, sorry, through you, Mayor, the two time periods that you quoted in the matrix work focused on a drought in the 1960s, another in the 1990s. The one in the 1960s was quite severe in terms of relative to other average drought conditions, whereas the one in the 1990s was not as bad. There was, over the time period that the drought occurred, it was interrupted in certain years by higher precipitation events. So this is the study, the methodology that's been used for Tier 3 studies for several Tier 3 projects in this sort of general area of the Tier 3s that have been done for bedrock supplies in this area. So it's an accepted methodology. I know for the city of Guelph, Matrix has also done some more detailed modeling work looking at climate change scenarios beyond those two drought periods that I mentioned. And what it's shown is that the recharge of the groundwater system is actually increased over the climate change scenario time period. And that's related to the increased frequency of high intensity precipitation events. Which when taken over a period of many decades results in increased recharge to the system.
Councilor McCray?
Let's see here. Okay, limit growth option. In Table 19, assessment and evaluation of water supply alternatives, following page 43, under the categories social, cultural, environmental, the report states that limited growth as an option has low public acceptance. We feel that under the provincial and county growth mandate for Centre Wellington, this was never an option that residents really had, since the mandated target is now enshrined in the county official plan. Many residents may have indeed preferred this option had they thought it could be given any serious consideration, and limiting growth while not adding capacity would limit the demand for future water. Would this not accomplish the same thing?
It would, yes. Through you, Mr. Mayor. The limit growth option and the do nothing option are always included in Class EAs and master plans as a point of comparison for potential impacts of the other alternatives being considered. So do nothing specifically is sometimes selected as a preferred alternative where the environmental impacts are so onerous that they aren't acceptable or can't be mitigated. The limit growth option is sometimes considered if there is not a solution that is locally sustainable, and that could be through water supply, or it could be your wastewater assimilative capacity of the receiving stream that would limit how much the community can grow. Otherwise, your growth targets are somewhat dictated by the province. So one mechanism that a municipality might have is that if the costs associated with what's being proposed as a preferred alternative is so economically unfeasible that you make the argument that it's preferable to limit growth as opposed to continue growing and incur those costs. So those are the options that a municipality has. From our standpoint, when we look at a system where there is locally sustainable resources, the limit growth generally doesn't stack up against that unless there are these other factors to be considered.
And I think when we talk about limiting growth, that's kind of where we come in and the town comes in, not so much the experts that we brought in to look at the different scenarios.
Agreed. Like if
Right,
we were to
it's
come
not
to
your
you and
call.
say, sorry, township, there is no locally sustainable groundwater to be had here, and the surface water isn't environmentally acceptable, then that might be something that you would consider moving forward with.
I have a couple of my own questions. I guess one is when you talk about putting a sentry well in between wells F1 and F2 to, I guess, monitor for the possibility of TCE movement, whereabouts are you planning to put that well?
We didn't identify, sorry, through you, Mayor, we didn't identify a specific parcel as part of this study, but that would be part of the next step, which we outlined as the groundwater exploration phase. So part of that study would be to sort of, I was going to say drill down, zoom into that level and identify a specific drilling location for that well. So the idea is to place it in between those wells as a location where you can monitor both the levels and the quality of the system, both the aquifers and the aquatards in that between those two wells, but we haven't identified a specific parcel.
Councilor McRae?
Thank you, Mayor Lynn. Okay, in the Water Supply Master Plan, section 4.2.1.1, page 14, what is meant by the comment, and I quote, "Further, a replacement F2 well should be strategically operated such that the water level in the new well is maintained above the F1 water level, thus maintaining the containment condition." I mean, I understand that you're proposing to drill F2 deeper and put casement. I just don't understand what that means.
Through you, Mayor. So that's referring to the level, the water level in the aquifer at each location, so the F1 and F2 location. So just general principle, the water's gonna flow from the area of higher, we call it higher potential, so higher elevation to the lower elevation. And so the idea there is to maintain flow inwards towards F1. And we refer to it here as a hydraulic trap. The idea is basically that water's converging on F1 rather than flowing to F2 from the location of where we think contamination may be existing.
Councilor McRae?
So in other words, ensuring that the rate of pumping does not pull the water away from the natural flow towards F1? Is that sort of layman's terms?
Generally, yes.
Okay, thank you. I guess just one general comment. Reading through both the Tier 3 and the Water Supply Master Plan, I found both reports excellent. I mean, I enjoyed reading them, and I'd just like to say thank you. I thought you did it fairly well in terms of covering all the bases.
Thank you.
Councilor Kitchers?
Thank you, Mayor. To follow up, so F1 you state is 79.5 meters deep. And then you say that F2 is 162 meters, or is that where you're going to be drilling it to?
Yeah, that's right. That's referring to a replacement well. I believe the number was 116.
So if that's lower in the ground than the F1, won't it actually go to the lower level? Be pumping to, won't it will be moving towards F2?
Are you referring, sorry, can you rephrase?
If F2 is 162 meters deep and the other one's 79, 80, won't it move towards F2?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at this one through Mayor Linton. So, yeah, the depth of the well, if it's in the same unit, because we're measuring from ground surface varies. So I think F2 might be a little higher ground surface, so maybe a deeper. So we'd have to check the elevation, I think, to see like meters above sea level to determine whether that depth of the well is actually higher. But really, groundwater flows based on difference in water elevation. So really, we're looking at, you know, kind of that potential, the high flows from a high area to a low area. And so that's, so the depth of the well doesn't impact it to the same extent. If we're in the same unit, it flows based on from a high water level area to a lower area. I don't know, Matt, if you want to add anything to that.
No, I agree with that. Yeah.
Councillor Kittrus?
But isn't F1 higher than F2, like situated on the ground?
So I can take that one, Colin. So what Colin was referencing was the actual elevation of the water in the well, so not ground surface.
Councillor Kittrus?
I guess I want to go back to the social, cultural, environmental category there, where it had about limited growth. And it says the option for limited growth will not meet the growth target. So those were the county targets presented to us. And then it said low public acceptance. And I'm wondering, did you get data for that low public acceptance?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, we did have several people attend the PIC that made reference to the importance to have sufficient water for proposed growth. We did not get many comments related, although we did get some, suggesting that limited growth should be considered further.
Councillor Kittrus?
So you didn't really actually have a formal survey to get a real input from the community?
No, we didn't.
Councillor Kittrus?
I'm wondering why you put that comment in there then. I'm wondering you just say we just had verbal consultation at the meetings, because it leads us to believe that you know, the community as a whole was surveyed and they didn't want limited growth, and it's not true.
We can certainly update the commentary in the table to reflect that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Appreciate answering all the questions, and encourage council and other members of in the gallery and other members of the public, the thousands that are watching this live stream. Make sure you get your comments in. You have about a month to get your comments in before this comes back to council for approval. So again, we answered a lot of questions. I appreciate all the work and time that went into these reports, and thanks for coming with us, coming and explaining things to us today. Appreciate that. So I have a recommendation here that the Council of the Township of Centre Wellington receive as information report number IS 2019-15 entitled Water Supply Master Plan Phase 2 Consultation Summary and Recommended Alternatives. I have a mover for that recommendation, Councillor McCrae, seconded by Councillor Dunsmore. All in favor? And that's received for information. And can I have a motion to adjourn? Councillor Kittrus, seconded by Councillor Dunsmore. All in favor? And we are adjourned. Thank you again, everyone, for coming out. And we'll see you, if you want to, next Monday.